assessment, adaptation, evaluation, and implementation science. She is also a core member of our San Diego CFAR IS Hub. Her research focuses on public mental health and substance use treatment, healthcare reform, evidence-based practice implementation and sustainment in complex systems, such as child welfare and advancement of culturally and contextually relevant programs to support populations affected by health and healthcare inequities. And then Dr. Wilging is here with Dr. Daniel Shatak, a research scientist in the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation as well. He's an applied sociocultural anthropologist with a focus on addressing the health disparities of structurally vulnerable populations, particularly sexual and gender minority youth. His work is heavily influenced by ethnographic methods, multimodal and long-term engagement with local communities, and a holistic perspective. And I would just say that during our first session with them, I just learned so much about their specific research interests. So I look forward to learning more today. Thank you so much for being here. And I will hand this over to you now.
Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes, thank you so much, Danielle.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, so thank you everyone for being here today. We really appreciate it. Katie and I are excited to talk with you all about conducting interviews and focus groups. To give you a little bit of an outline of where we're headed today, we'll start off with a brief orientation to qualitative interviews and focus groups, dive into talking about recruiting and sampling, and then move through kind of the mechanics of constructing a quality interview guide. How to conduct interviews and focus groups. And then we've included some tips on conducting online interviews and focus groups, since that's become an increasingly popular way of collecting this data over the past few years. And then wrapping up with some tips around debriefing after you've conducted an interview or a focus group. So first, I would really love for everyone to hop into the chat and let us know your thoughts about this question. It gives us kind of a better guide as to where to lead the discussion today. Why would you use a qualitative interview or focus group for implementation research? This can be either specific to your own projects, how you use them, or what you think you would use them for in general for an implementation science study. Give folks a few seconds here to respond in the chat. Awesome, we've got the chat waterfall going. So to help tell stories, pick up the nuances, collect stakeholder input for creating community-based interventions, to inform person-centered interventions, to identify barriers and facilitators, to obtain exploratory data, explore and explain, conducting as part of a needs assessment, figuring out cultural adaptations, contextualizing findings. Yeah, these are all amazing. To give the population you work with the chance to share their own voice, gain a more nuanced understanding of behaviors and activities. Yeah, so I feel like you all have a really great expansive knowledge of the use of qualitative interviews and focus groups. Awesome. So just like you all have said, qualitative interviews and focus groups are really great for understanding the who, what, how, and why of implementation science. Qualitative interviews, we're focusing in on personal experiences, feelings, ideas, opinions of individual participants, versus focus groups where we are identifying group norms and experiences and opinions. Both have really wonderful interpretive value to help connect particular events and phenomena or beliefs from participants' vantage points. And they're great for gaining a lot of really in-depth information and a breadth of insights from a variety of participants within our studies. Some beginning assumptions here. Both methods can be very labor intensive and expensive. There's the work that goes into preparing and recruiting and sampling for interviews and focus groups, then the work of creating a guide, then the work of conducting the interviews and focus groups, then the work of analyzing and reporting. This all requires training and practice. Katie and I believe, touched on preparing our qualitative research teams in the first session, but making sure that your team is all trained and well-versed in the interview protocols, the guides beforehand is critical to making sure that you get quality data. Interviews and focus groups, because we're interacting with people, require that the interviewer or the facilitator have good interpersonal skills. You're sometimes interacting with perfect strangers and getting them to tell you about fairly sensitive topics. And that requires a lot of really strong interpersonal skills and ability to build rapport quickly. And interviews and focus groups are also this like dialogic situation, right? So we need to be able to put actions and behaviors into context. We need to be able to understand that what we're eliciting during an interview or a focus group isn't existing in a bubble, that we understand it in context of the interview situation itself, but also be able to place that into the larger context of the implementation project. Some hallmarks of these methods. First, they typically are more open-ended versus closed or fixed alternative questions where you have folks pick a pre-selected answer or say yes or no or provide a number. You really want to be able to elicit longer responses from our participants where they can create a response based on what they think is important. And then you have the ability to follow up and ask for clarification, explanation, for more information versus more closed-ended types of questionnaires or surveys where you get the one answer and maybe there's a couple of follow-up questions based on that answer. But interviews and focus groups really allow us to elicit ongoing data and really clarify what participants are saying and thinking. So this first section will focus in on recruiting and sampling for interviews and focus groups. Oops. There's a bunch of different ways to figure out sampling for these, but the most commonly used in implementation science is going to be some form of purposive sampling. This means that we're selecting participants based on some sort of pre-selected criteria based on study objectives. And our sample size for interviews and focus groups will really vary based on the objectives of the study, resources available, and time. And it's often determined based on however you're conceptualizing saturation for your data, be it theoretical saturation, you're trying to flesh out a theory that's emerging from your work because you're using grounded theory approaches, or you're using more of a data saturation approach, where you're looking to find redundancy in your data, and then you know like no new information is coming up, therefore you've reached saturation. And these types of and I'll dive into a few examples of purposive sampling to give us a better understanding of how this works. So one example would be criterion sampling. So using pre-selected criteria to determined to be important. So maybe you want to conduct interviews or focus groups with patients that have low satisfaction with their care in some sort of service setting. And maybe you've conducted a survey already. And so you've identified participants or patients or potential participants that have low satisfaction with their care. We're not necessarily going to need to worry about those with high satisfaction. So we are able to zero in on those that have a lower score. Maximum variation sampling, on the other hand, we're looking for a lot of variety in the participants that we're sampling. Excuse me. This allows us to create themes and find patterns that cut across the variation in cases that we have. So sampling across geographies might be one example. In primary care settings, those in like urban centers versus rural areas, especially here in New Mexico, vary widely. So maybe that's a point of variation that we want to make sure that we're capturing within our data. Similarly, you may be looking for extreme or deviant cases, these kind of like outliers that differ a lot from the majority of cases. In that case, you're going for extreme or deviant case sampling. And this really, the best example that I can think of for this is looking at outstanding cases and failures, which is relevant to our implementation science, right? Those that are really great at achieving implementation outcomes like adoption versus those that are maybe falling behind. You want to understand the differences between those two cases. Homogeneous sampling, this is often used in focus groups because we want to find a balance between a variety of perspectives, but not finding too diverse of a group that the conversation doesn't yield any kind of group meaning or group consensus. But you're looking to find folks that are similar in some sort of aspect to explore a topic or a group of people in more depth. And then critical case sampling, selecting for information-rich cases. You can think about, in the case of a clinic, you're maybe going to try and interview the lead administrator because they have a view of the entire clinic. In that situation, you're going for a really information-rich case to understand the context of that clinic. Some key differences here to keep in mind between interviews and focus groups. For the interview, you're really sampling for the individual participant and what they can tell you about whatever it is you're asking for. And the individual is the unit of analysis versus the focus group, where sampling concerns both the type of individuals that you're asking to be a part of that group, as well as the composition of the group itself. And then the group becomes the unit of analysis. The focus really is on the conversation, the discussion, the intersubjectively created data that is yielded out of that group, rather than the experience of any one individual member of the focus group. Hopefully that makes sense. When assembling a focus group, we typically include folks of similar backgrounds who have insights to share about study issues. Like I said, we're aiming at more purposive sampling procedures versus trying to get a representative sample. Excuse me. And even though we really are looking for a complete picture from focus groups, from interviews, sampling to the point of getting a lot of redundant information to signal that we have data saturation might often be too costly or too time consuming. Depending on the objectives of your study and the diversity of the participants, 1 to 2 to maybe 3 focus groups might be sufficient to start getting data saturation. Oh, there you go, 3 to 4 groups per population category of interest. So I'm thinking of a study that we conducted in schools, and we have IRT teams per site. And so that becomes the center focus of our focus groups. Or if we're working, we have a needs assessment of youth housing going on right now in southern New Mexico. We're aiming to understand the context of a bunch of different community-based organizations. And so we have those as the unit of analysis, and those will be the groups that they'll aim for focus groups. And yes, we have the citations at the end of the slides too, I believe. And traditionally, in constructing focus groups, participants typically don't really know each other very well. However, in implementation science, because we have this more kind of closed system or more specific contexts that we're studying, like clinics or schools, participants probably know each other. So that provides for different considerations when assembling these groups and conducting interviews. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Oh, and I already mentioned this. Traditionally, recruitment for qualitative interviews or focus groups, we would be looking for participants that have particular kinds of characteristics, or members of a population of interest, or have particular knowledge in certain subject areas or topics. In implementation science, we have really well-defined contexts that we're pulling from. So like I said, clinics, schools, hospitals, we have this kind of boundedness to where we probably want to be sampling from. So the pool, the larger population, is probably smaller and much more specific. In terms of recruitment, there's a variety of different ways. We've just included some that we've made use of in some of our work. The first being direct invitations. Often in implementation science, you know who you need to be interviewing. Therefore, you can send them a direct invitation, a nice email, phone call, set up a meeting to chat and discuss the possibility of an interview or focus group. Other times you might be reaching out via social media, trying to do some sort of advertising with flyers or posters. And then the third idea here is one of my personal favorites, is outcropping and community engagement strategies. Outcropping is going to places where you know your population of interest usually hangs out. This is a great strategy for particularly vulnerable or stigmatized populations. Excuse me. Other strategies here are attending events or volunteering with organizations that serve those populations, and building rapport with the gatekeepers, the folks that run the organizations, or maybe leaders within that population. The example that comes to mind at the moment is our project focused on youth homelessness. So we're trying to interview youth experiencing housing insecurity, that have difficulty finding a place to live, those types of things. And so I've been heavily involved in our Coalition to End Homelessness, attending youth advisory board meetings, hanging out and taking like snacks over to one of the organizations that serves youth during the day, and building rapport with the staff that work there, taking them out for coffee. All of this stuff allows us to get entree into these populations, to then be able to engage them in interviews and focus groups. But it takes time, it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of those interpersonal skills to build those relationships that can lead to it. So while it may not be as time effective or cost effective as direct outreach or advertising, it can yield some really, really high quality, rich data when you do end up landing those interviews and focus groups. And then, of course, definitely send reminders to those who agree to participate. If you've booked an interview or a focus group follow-up, make sure that folks understand when and where to be, and that they are going to show up. So just a couple of examples of how we've done some sampling. So I mentioned this earlier, a project that we are wrapping up with schools across New Mexico, helping them implement LGBTQ plus supportive practices, with the idea that it would help reduce incidences of risk experiences, risk behaviors, and then translate into better health outcomes for them, like around suicide, depression, substance use. But so the structure of the sampling, we use purposive sampling. We wanted to make sure to interview a school administrator and the lead of the implementation resource team for each of the schools involved. And then we wanted to make sure to have a focus group with the implementation resource team at each school. So there, our sampling really is structured based on the schools that are involved in the study and the levels of kind of leadership within the school that we wanted to try and influence, or that have influence over the implementation of those practices. And then, of course, sampling from each of the schools, because we have to understand all of them. The second example here was an exploratory study that Katie and I conducted, examining the preparedness of emergency departments in New Mexico for caring for transgender and gender diverse patients. And so in this, we used more of a criterion and convenience sampling kind of approach. We identified 3 emergency departments in the state based on geographic variation. So we had one that was in a really large urban center, one that was in a smaller urban center, and one that was more rural. So we got a bit of diversity across the state geographically, and with that, resources and population variety. And then we used reputational case selection, so a different type of recruiting and sampling strategy, where we asked for recommendations of folks that would be good for us to interview that have particular knowledge or experience working with transgender and gender diverse patients. And then from there, asking for further recommendations. And so we knew that we wanted to have doctors, nurses, and other frontline staff. So we have those 3 groups that we then use those strategies to find participants within. And then finally, trying to find transgender and gender diverse patients that have experiences in those emergency departments. We followed more of a convenient sampling approach with some reputational case selection strategies and outcropping. So hanging out at local LGBTQ plus resource centers, transgender resource centers, putting up flyers and posters, asking for recommendations from folks that we interacted with, and then all of those combined to help us find participants for this exploratory study. So you can use these all in combination. It's not just one strategy is going to, to get you all of the participants that you need. Sometimes you have to combine. And I hinted at this earlier when I was talking about the fact that in implementation science, we typically are interviewing folks that know each other. It's very, very high in implementation science, especially when we're working in smaller contexts like clinics or schools. And so there arises this concern for power dynamics in both the sampling process and in the data collected. Excuse me. So in terms of the data that gets collected, an example of this would be the study that we conducted in schools. For our focus groups with the implementation resource teams, the staff, we chose to exclude any administrators or the team lead from that focus group because we wanted to make sure that there wasn't any undue influence from, a supervisor being in the room when they were sharing their thoughts and experiences about the implementation process and outcomes. Having them in the room might have greatly influenced their responses to our questions, especially when it came to asking them about leadership and administrative support. The second example here is a clinic-based organizational intervention study that we've been involved with. And the sampling for the qualitative work has been across executive levels for agencies, clinical level leadership, and then staff. And in this, there's the double bind of executives and clinic level leadership may tell their staff that they have to participate in a focus group or very strongly suggest, even though it's an open invitation and it's completely voluntary on our side, staff might have gotten a different impression based on leadership's signaling to them that they should be participating in a focus group. So right off the bat, you have this kind of bias of folks being voluntold to participate. So their willingness to engage is likely affected by that. Excuse me. And then the type of data that you're going to be getting out of that focus group will be influenced by their willingness to participate. Cool. Did you have anything to add, Katie?
No, not at this point. I do want to have a reminder that there are citations that are going to be provided in the resource guide and at the end of the presentation. And for some of the slides that don't have the citations, it's likely because it's sort of common knowledge and it's something that we've been experiencing in our own work. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you for that.
Yes, Corsico, we have a section on focus groups. So let's turn back when we get to that section, let's talk about expertise in focus groups. All right, so let's just go quickly over designing your interview guides and focus group guides. Daniel, were you going to do this section or am I doing it? I thought so. So last time we were presenting, we talked about having a funnel structure when designing your interview and focus group guides. And this funnel structure really involves, starting off very broadly, starting off with easy questions, warming folks up, getting into the main body, the meat of what you want to learn about. You start off broad and you get a more specific, narrower topics, perhaps more sensitive questions. And then you want to have a cool off period where you're not asking really meaty questions. You want the person to leave feeling pretty good. And then there's your closure. This funnel structure is useful for building trust, creating a relaxed and open atmosphere. And it, as I mentioned, also helps with moving on to more sensitive topics. Next slide. And here's an example of how we're using this funnel structure in our current study on assessing youth experiences with homelessness and trajectories of homelessness. So the objective was to examine the lived experience of young people who don't have stable homes regarding their housing histories, the type of formal and informal support systems they have available, the behaviors that are associated with risk for certain illnesses or health conditions, or social vulnerabilities. Also health and barriers and facilitators to addressing their housing needs. So we start off with, our introductions. Then we move on to questions regarding where the young person's from, what it's like, what they like about their current town, what they do for fun. So we're really trying to make them comfortable and set a positive tone. We then go into their histories of housing insecurities, their experiences at school, with social supports, financial difficulties, moving on to physical and behavioral health challenges, and then, the headier topics of abuse and violence, law enforcement and justice system involvement, as well as foster care and child protective services involvement. Our cool-off period really focuses on their recommendations to make things better for youth experiencing homelessness, their advice for system leaders and organizational leaders, and any final thoughts they might have to share. And then there's the closure where we give them a big thank you. And we also make it clear that they can contact us at any point to learn about the study, its progress, the findings. Next slide. So in terms of formulating your interview guide, the kinds of questions you want to ask need to be really singular and neutral. This means asking about one thing at a time, not implying a right or wrong answer. Clear and easily understandable questions, such as using terms that make sense to people. And I think, as Daniel pointed out during our last session, some of the terms we use in implementation science, they're just not part of everyday vernacular for people. You really want to tailor your language to the participant group. And of course, you want to ask open-ended questions where you're going to get at people's experiences, feelings, ideas, opinions, their knowledge. And remember that you're not conducting an interrogation or quiz. There's two types of questions. There's STEM questions, and then there's follow-up questions or probes. And some of these follow-up questions or probes, you want to anticipate in advance. So you want to put them on your guide, and then others you're going to come up with on the fly when you're actually engaging folks. Next slide. So here is a question. Is it a good or bad question to ask? Now, the first question I'd like to ask you, just to get us started, is how you and your colleagues at this agency first happened to find out about the Community Health Worker HIV Prevention Initiative. What it was like when you first came, how you think about it now and what impact it's had on your workplace. So anybody have any thoughts about this type of question? If you could drop it in the chat, that would be great. Yep, so a bit broad, not a great question, too many questions in one, more than one question at once, so too many nested questions, whole study in one question. And you know, it's not an uncommon experience to review a transcript and see this type of question being asked. And this is the type of thing you want to avoid when developing your interview guide or your focus group guide, and when you're training folks to implement the guides. So we really do recommend, you know, piloting your data collectors and looking at their transcripts soon after they do some, you know, early interviews or focus groups to get a sense of how are they asking the questions. Are they departing from the interview guide? And is there a problem with your interview guide that leads to a question like this? Next slide. So again, you want to avoid double-barreled questions or asking two or more questions in one. So, you know, here's an example that we've encountered, you know, along the lines of, in what ways do the rules differ for boys and girls and mothers and fathers? Can you give me an example? So here they're asking, you know, about boys and girls and then their parents. And these really should be separated into different lines of inquiry. Another question, what can you tell me about what this school is doing to make it safer for kids who are refugees, BIPOC, LGBTQ, and what are the specific needs related to each of these groups of kids? So again, asking about too many things in a single question. These are the things you want to avoid. And when you're designing your guide, you know, think, am I asking too much in this question? Does this question just have too much ambition? So ask singular questions. Next slide. Make sure that the questions use terms and phrases that are understandable to participants. And, you know, I will often run by, you know, the interview guides and the focus group guides with people from that population. And that's a good way to get a sense of, are you asking the question in the right way? You want to use terminology appropriate for the participants' command of language, their level of knowledge, their cultural background, their age. So we recently completed a study with Native American elders about their healthcare experiences. And, you know, we were from very different backgrounds. And we had elder consultant data collectors, you know, join us in this endeavor to really make sure that we were engaging in age-appropriate, culturally appropriate questioning. But ultimately, you want to ensure the clarity of your questions. Next slide. Avoid dichotomous questions. These are questions that suggest a yes or no response. An example here, you know, are you satisfied with your involvement in the prep program? Has your practice changed as a result of your participation in this program? Do you know the procedures for enrolling in the prep program? So you kind of want to use a different opening. How satisfied are you? In what ways has your practice changed? What are the procedures for enrolling? So, you know, think about those how, what, and why questions when you're formulating what you want to ask about. If you're asking dichotomous questions, you might be limiting expression. You're not inviting participants to share their experiences, their feelings, their ideas, their opinions, their knowledge, and that's what you really want to get at. Next slide. Avoid long questions, like in that, that earlier slide with the chat. Again, questions involving jargon or leading questions. So leading questions are ones that will imply a positive or negative response. Use neutral wording. Allow your questions to evolve. So in our last study, you know, in year one, we had a question that asked what policies and procedures are in place to address the particular needs of LGBTQ students. And then we asked how useful are these policies and procedures, how long have they been in effect, and how could they be improved upon? But we kind of learned over time when we were engaging the schools that was too broad. We had to give people examples about what we meant when we were referring to policies and procedures, because people weren't thinking very expansively. You know, in subsequent years, we built some more probes into our question. So we started off with what policies and procedures are now in place at the school that concern LGBTQ students. These could include dress codes, procedures to protect students from being outed, rules about social events like prom, protections against bullying based on sexual orientation. And then we would ask our probes. And then we added some more probes about how policies shifted because of certain legislative action that had happened in the state of New Mexico, and then asking how the school went about making the changes. So it's really important to revisit your interview guides over time, and you're going to learn more the more you interact with the sites that are in your study, and you want to be able to ask questions in a way that people can respond, that are going to give you a good response. There's something to consider when coming up with your interview guides. You really want to think about the format. What's going to work for you? And it really depends on interviewer or moderator preferences. Some people like large, easy to read font. Some people like to have lots of space in between the questions to put their notes. Other people, like me, like to use a separate notebook. You can start sections on new pages, but ultimately you want your guide to be well organized. And again, follow that funnel structure, but a well-organized guide will help you with transcription and analysis. They're also useful for creating matrices, for kind of arranging your data, creating little data nuggets per categories or domains of interest, or your research questions. They allow for efficient review. And I think it's useful to have a well-formulated guide, a neat guide, because you might have to include it in a publication appendice. So I like to pay attention to that detail. In some instances, you might want to include elicitation tools. These can be useful in interviews and focus groups. You can share something so you can get feedback on a process or a product. You can share a vignette to get reactions to a specific situation. But ultimately, whatever elicitation tool you want to use, you want something to be low burden. You don't want people to have to do a lot of homework before the group. So something that you could share during the group. You don't want to overcomplicate things. In our study with youth, we're using a timeline to collect housing insecurity histories. So we share the timeline with the youth and we ask about different periods in their life. We're also using Google mapping with youth to help identify hotspot locations where youth hang out. Because we're going to be doing a youth count down the road where we're actually trying to find youth and come up with an estimate of how many young people are experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness. Make sure you pilot the interview or focus group guides. And again, like I said, it's a good idea to share the interview and focus group guides in draft forms with people who might be of your population of interest. Piloting the guide helps you feel out the flow, identify areas that are poorly worded, questions that are confusing, leading questions, areas of interest missed. And I think that's a really big thing to be thinking about. Also, it helps you estimate the time it's going to take to do your interview or focus group. Then you can trim the fat and also work out any kind of technological issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, but are there any questions in the chat that we need to address before we move on?
There's one from Borsica about, do we ever ask a question that is not directly related to the topic to warm up or seemingly not directly related?
This is a great question. I probably try to make every question count. So that broad question I'm going to ask at the get-go is going to have something to do with what I want to what I'm studying. Daniel, do you have anything to add to that one?
So I have 2 examples. And it's usually to try and build rapport with folks. And the more like nervous or reticent to engage I notice the person is going into it, the more like disconnected the question tends to be. So in one instance, I was interviewing young folks over Zoom about their experiences during the pandemic, being stuck at home and those types of things. And people between the ages of 13 and 18 vary in their willingness to engage in a Zoom interview. And so I would start off by asking them like what types of games they like to play, what their hobbies are. So like it seems like it's disconnected, but I'm getting information about how they're spending time at home. The other one that feels really disconnected was when I was interviewing someone for our last study, a school staff member, and she was very, very nervous for the interview for some reason. And so I started trying with the warm-up questions and nothing was working. And so then I realized like, oh, I got to try a different tactic with this. And on the drive in, I noticed that there was a burger place on the corner by the school. And so I asked her about the burgers there. And that went off into like 5 minutes of her telling me where the best green chili cheeseburger was. And so that little bit of like detour ended up providing an opening for the rest of the interview where she felt very comfortable answering my questions, because suddenly we're on this kind of like more friendly level than when we started the interview. So those would be my 2 examples that I think illustrate that.
And I think those examples really underscore why it's important to have people with great interpersonal skills so they can kind of pick up on that nervousness and know when they have to like pivot and to ask that kind of question that's gonna, help people feel more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. And very likely you're not going to include questions about cheeseburgers in your in your interview guide. That's something that you'll have to figure out how to do on the fly, unless you're actually interviewing about burgers.
And we're going to talk more about focus groups, but in terms of the shyness, yes, people can be very shy. And we try to let people know who are shy that we might want to ask them questions. They don't have to answer if they don't feel comfortable. We might also like try and touch base with them, after that interaction, so we can give them a safe space where they're comfortable, responding to some of the questions. But it's not uncommon to find people who are shy. And if you can set the right tone in that focus group, you can usually get people to share some of their thoughts. We'll talk more about focus groups right after this section.
Katie, there was one more, Daniel, I don't know if you had a chance to see that. Does your training and practice process involve training all team members, researchers, scientists, community members about the dynamic conditions to facilitate meaningful and respectful engagement? For example, about microaggression, trauma-informed approaches. If so, what sort of resources and training are you sharing with them?
That's a great question. We do have some modules on cultural fluency that we've used. We did, do a training. When we do for right now for our youth study, everybody's taking trauma-informed training when interacting with kids to really get at some of those issues. And it's actually a requirement of our funder. And it's great. And I think increasingly, funders are paying attention to these issues. When we had our elder study, we were having elders on our team who were providing us with the training in terms of how, what are the best practices for interacting with, elders, and asking them sensitive questions about their health and healthcare experiences. For a lot of the trainings that we do on a lot of the projects we do on LGBTQ issues, especially around implementation, our whole team is creating a host of trainings about like best practices for interacting with people and what are those microaggressions And, we're thinking about that in terms of our own practice when we're engaging participants. Daniel, did you want to add anything?
If you hadn't touched on the trauma training, I was going to touch on that. That was the thing that popped to my mind was everyone from the head staff to all the data collectors to even just volunteers that are helping like run water to teams are taking the trauma training. So. So I guess we'll move on into conducting qualitative interviews. To start off, I just want to find out, how do you all typically prepare for a qualitative interview? What kinds of things do you do beforehand to get yourselves ready? And using the bathroom is a valid answer. It was a joke. Yes, reread the interview guide and use the bathroom. Thank you, Nicole. Researching the person's background if possible. Yes. Get the interview guide out, make sure you've got your water, speaker set up appropriately, review the questions multiple times, make any side notes. Yeah, all these are great. Yeah, so ahead of time, make sure that you take time to do your homework. So as you all put into the chat, making sure that you know your interview guide inside and out really allows you the freedom to be able to make those kinds of pivots, to reword questions, to ask questions that are maybe not necessarily in the interview guide to help build rapport, but then you can easily steer yourself back in. If you're using a less structured interview, if you know the main points of your interview guide, then you can let the conversation flow however the participant leads it, but guiding them through different topics, even if it's not in the same particular order that you had in your guide. So knowing your interview guide inside and out. Also, knowing it really well allows you to speak more normally when you're talking with folks in an interview setting. If you sound like you're reading a question off of a page, your participant is going to hear that and respond accordingly. They may be uncomfortable. They may feel like you don't really know what you're asking. So making sure that you know your questions spot on. And reviewing what's already known. This is something that I really like to do, is to review what I know about the person or the organization that I'm stepping into, or the people that I'm interviewing in a focus group. Finding out, especially if it's a long-term project, going back and reviewing older transcripts to figure out what kinds of questions I might need to be asking them. In the school-based project, we have coaches. So chatting with coaches that have regular interaction with these people to find out if there's any kind of idiosyncrasies that I need to think about, any particular events that have happened, that if they don't bring them up, I need to ask them about those. So reviewing what's already known is a really great way to help improve the quality of the data that you're going to be collecting. The old school, making sure you've got your recording devices, extra batteries, which is my nightmare, to run out of batteries in the middle of an interview. Make sure you've got pens and paper on hand to take notes. And then of course the new school, making sure you have a stable internet connection. And now that I've mentioned that, I guarantee my internet is going to slow down and I'll start freaking out on us. But making sure that all the technological material parts of the interview are taken care of ahead of time, so you're not scrambling to take care of those while you're trying to start the warm-up period. I'm going to skip ahead briefly just to touch on something, and then I'll come back to this getting started. Something that has really helped our team with kind of the protocol of conducting interviews and focus groups is coming up with a procedures document. This is useful if you yourself are going to be doing all the work, as well as if you have a whole team. But so it's a document that runs you through all the preparatory kind of steps of setting up the interview, conducting the interview, and then the follow-up. I just included an example here from one of our studies in primary care settings around readiness to treat LGBTQ+ patients. And it starts off with kind of the most basic pieces, like how are we tracking who we're talking to? So the beginning of this guide explains how to create identification numbers, Then it moves into the before the interview. So it hits on all those pieces of make sure your recorder's ready. You've got extra batteries, you've got your incentive, you've got your guide, your consent form, and it's little check marks. From there, moves into the actual process of conducting the interview, arriving early, introducing yourself, conducting any kind of screening or asking for demographic information, moving through the interview guide, turning off your recorder when the interview is done, providing incentive, thank you. And then there's a section on like contingencies, what to do if there's a no-show or other kinds of instructions. And then as a final section on how to follow up, how do you store that data? So all of this is additional support around that guide that you've created, because that guide can be wonderful, but unless you're following a protocol to be able to carry it out effectively, and if you're working in a team similarly across different researchers, it's going to be all over the place. So having something like this well established beforehand is a really helpful tool. Ooh, went too far. So when you're first starting an interview, you want to make sure that you're introducing yourself, introducing the project if they're not already familiar, even if they are familiar, reiterating in terms that refresh their memory. And then, of course, acknowledging sponsorship is helpful sometimes too. So if we're on an NIH-sponsored research study, that carries a lot of weight in our community with different stakeholders, because they know what the NIH is. They know that we're serious and that this is something that they want to engage with. So even just acknowledging a funder or your organization can carry a lot of weight in establishing this as like an official interaction. You want to make sure that you're ensuring confidentiality, explain to them how you're going to protect their confidentiality, how you're going to protect their privacy. And then remind folks that even though this is an interview or a focus group, you really are there to get their views, their opinions, their feelings, their experiences. Often I'll get folks that say, oh, I don't know, and then they'll end. So then you have to go and probe for more information, or make sure you ask for permission to record the interview or the focus group. And in this, there's this balance between not being tentative, not being very timid when you're asking, and allowing folks to have an out immediately to say, no, I don't want to be recorded, and being coercive, forcing them to use the recording. Excuse me. I've had instances where a recording has been extremely inappropriate, and so we have to pivot. So that balance between being assertive with a recording, but not coercive, usually will work in getting you the recording. If someone is really, really adamant about not being recorded, they'll let you know. I interviewed a school administrator in a rural town that really did not want to do the interview if it was going to be recorded. And the only way I would get him to do the interview was if I was not recording and only taking hand notes, because he was sharing some views that he did not necessarily think that I would agree with, or that other study participants or that other researchers would agree with. And so even though I assured him about protections of confidentiality and privacy, it really helped that I just nixed the recorder in that situation. Once you've established whether or not you're recording, moving on into the warm-up questions. And yes, so Borska asked about whether or not acknowledging funder or organizations makes people more or less comfortable. And Katie responded that that's one of the reasons why it's important to do your homework about the folks that you're going to go interview. In some instances, that might actually make them a lot less likely to engage with you if they think that you're a part of the federal government or something like that. So making sure that you're acknowledging the organizations or the institutions that they will respond positively to. And so while you're conducting an interview, there's this balance between intense listening and intense questioning. You want to be an active listener above all. Allow space for folks to really express what they want to express in response to your questions. And in that, listening very closely for cues for you to ask follow-up questions, how to adjust how you're asking questions. If someone uses a particular word for something that you asked about, maybe shift to using their language so that you're able to mirror and it's more relevant to how they're talking about stuff. Excuse me. Along with that, taking extra steps to ensure cultural humility, acknowledging where you don't understand something. One of the big things that Katie's already touched on is in the project with Native American elders, we had other elders conducting the interviews with us. And so that was a major part of how we adapted the interviewing process for that particular population. It was more appropriate for us to go into those spaces with someone from that community and then interact with someone else versus just kind of like plopping in ourselves and interviewing folks. Excuse me. This doesn't have anything to do with listening necessarily, but it has to do with the interaction, and it's not on the slide. But it's something that came up recently when I was interviewing youth for our needs assessment, dressing appropriately for the interactions. If you are interviewing executives, leadership of organizations, of institutions, maybe a suit and tie, maybe a polo is appropriate. If you're interviewing youth on the street experiencing homelessness, that dress will not work. I was interviewing some youth and they took it upon themselves to give me some fashion tips for more appropriate clothing to wear when I'm interacting with young folks. So making sure your appearance even matches well with the situation. I know that's slightly unrelated to this, but it's helpful sometimes. As you're conducting the interview, really sincerely try to understand what your participant is trying to tell you. In this, if you're an outsider to a population, a community, a clinic, any kind of context, you can really lean into your naivete around topics. You can ask these questions because you're assumed to have a low level of understanding of them. So lean into that. Use that curiosity, that genuine want to understand to fuel your questioning. Be open and listen for unexpected comments. Folks surprise us constantly with their responses to questions. So making sure you're maintaining kind of non-expectation around how people are going to respond to a particular question. And in that, allowing your thinking to be changed by what you hear. Yeah. So some key strategies to help support active listening in this. As you open the interview or open a section of an interview, invite really lengthy initial responses. Use these kinds of springboard questions that elicit a longer response. So how do you typically deal with X? It's a much broader question that'll get the flow of conversation going. And then you can move into probing, which creates these further ways of exploring topics, asking for clarification, those types of things. Paraphrasing, so mirroring back what someone has told you, acknowledges that you're listening. It creates an opportunity for you to clarify and make sure that you're understanding what they're telling you. And if they know that you're listening, you're interested, they'll tend to talk more. And I know this is a big anxiety for a lot of folks based on the chat, but making sure that you're recording. You can be the best interviewer, have the best guide, but if you haven't captured what's being said in that interview or that focus group, it's going to be for naught. So make sure that you're recording to the best of your ability so that you can make sure that you capture what folks say in their own words. And make sure that you're taking notes so that if the recorder does, run out of battery or the internet connection goes wonky on you, you still have your notes. These notes don't have to be verbatim, but they should be really strategic and focused. That like excessive note-taking that some of us do during interviews and focus groups is really distracting to our participants. They suddenly zero in on the fact that your pen or your typing is going so fast, there's no possible way that you could be really listening and processing to what they're saying. So if you allow that space where you just strategically write down phrases or note times in the interview where you want to go back to it, that'll be a much more effective way of taking notes than if you're trying to take verbatim notes during the interview. Excuse me. Notes can also help you formulate new questions as an interview progresses, even within the interview or across interviews. So like we showed that example of that question in year 1 versus year 5, that came out of us taking notes about how people were answering the questions. And so we were able to adjust over time. Or if you don't want to necessarily mess up the flow of conversation of the interview, you can take notes for yourself to go back and ask a clarifying question or some sort of probe around a topic that they touched on briefly. Something that happens constantly for me is that folks use acronyms that I don't know. So I'll write down the acronym and then I'll go back to it after they've finished their thought. Your notes can also serve as kind of preliminary data before the formal analysis starts, so that you can go ahead and start shaping, your code trees, code books, framing how you want to look at the data, particular patterns that maybe are already starting to emerge just based on your initial notes. Excuse me. And then of course, it serves as a backup in case anything happens to the recording or transcription. Yeah, and I've already mentioned this a little bit, but making sure that you're returning back to incomplete or unclear information. So like I said, I hear a lot of acronyms. I tend to go back and ask about those, what they mean. But you can ask about, what did you mean by a particular phrase that you use? So in this example, equitable treatment. Maybe somebody mentioned a navigator portal system and you want to know how that works. Or you want them to repeat the steps for enrolling a particular program. Just like we don't want to make assumptions about our interviewees' body of knowledge, we want to elicit the information from them. We also want to make sure that they're not assuming our level of knowledge either. So if there's these moments of they think that we know what they mean by that, we want to chase down their meaning. And then at the end, we want to make sure that we have a cool off and closure period, being mindful of time. I always acknowledge when we're getting close to the end of the interview period, just to make sure that my interviewee or my focus group folks know that I'm thinking about their time and I'm trying to be respectful of it. If they have extra time, maybe they'll give it to you. If not, no worries. But after you've covered the main topics in the body of the interview, then you can come back to a few general questions to lighten the atmosphere and on a positive note, especially if you've been touching on something really personal, emotional, or sensitive, just kind of lightening the mood back up without, so that you don't end on a bummer, basically. Excuse me. Make sure that you leave space at the end for any remaining thoughts from your interviewee, and asking for recommendations based on your study objectives. So if you're trying to create an intervention or change something about a system or organization, after they've reflected on everything during the body of the interview, they're really well prepped to offer you recommendations at the end. And then of course, expressing your appreciation, be it through thank you, an incentive of some kind, sending a thank you note, following up with a thank you email, those kinds of things. After the interview, check your recording, upload it to somewhere safe, and then get the transcription process going. Make extensive notes, clean up your notes that you took during the interview interaction, and compile your debriefing notes, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth in a minute. And then, like I said, say thank you, or if you want to re-engage that person, do something a bit more substantial and personal, like sending a thank you note.
All right. So we're going to move on to focus groups now. So is it okay if I skip any questions? Because I looked at my watch. All right. And this is like condensed from a potentially day-long training on how to do focus groups. So bear with us. All right, next slide. So advantages of focus groups, and focus groups are an interview. They're a special kind of interview. And when you're doing focus groups, you're really interested in learning about the views of many participants in one place in the same amount of time it would take you to interview one or two people. You want to assess the reactions of the participants to various ideas that are put on the table, and really get a sense of how strongly committed they are to their views and the changes that arise when different ideas are considered. So it's that conversation, it's that dialogue. Advantages of focus groups: they can be efficient, they can help you maximize the use of resources because you have fewer transcripts to analyze. You can get a lot of data in a short period of time. And because you don't have to do as many data collection events. There's less data preparation and analysis time compared to if you were doing a study that was dependent on individual interviews. And you can quickly assess the extent to which there's a consistent or shared view of a particular issue that you're studying, or if there's a diversity of views. There's a lot of reasons to use focus groups. They can help us develop locally valid surveys, help us identify appropriate questions and response categories. We can field test a survey or a questionnaire to make sure that it's coherent. We can use focus groups for usability testing and evaluation purposes. We can get input and assess reactions to a new intervention or program. And here's where we might use some of those elicitation tools we talked about earlier. They're great for community assessments. You can cross-check data from other methods. So we often use interviews and focus groups. So we'll share our interview findings with focus group participants and get a sense of how accurate are we? Are we on the right track here? What are we missing? Feedback from focus group can be more specific and meaningful than data from, let's say, individual questionnaires or surveys. And they tend to be enjoyable. I mean, when a focus group goes well, you do have this euphoric feeling afterwards. And people tend to leave the focus group feeling like they were affirmed, they were heard. And I think this has to do with the fact that we are as Michael Quinn Patton says, we're social animals. And there's a pull when it comes to doing a focus group. Some of the disadvantages are those shy people, or people who, might feel uncomfortable being in the group, or participants whose viewpoints are in the minority. They might be reluctant to speak up. They're not representative. Again, we're using purposive sampling. Not appropriate for assessing controversial or highly personal issues. We're not asking about individual experiences. They also occur outside natural settings where social interaction usually happens. They can also be difficult to pull together. Getting everybody, the logistics of finding the folks and getting them to come at the same time to the same place. You also can't ask the same number of the number of questions as you would in an interview. You're really restricted on how many questions you can ask. There's a limited response time for each participant, and actually a limited amount of time you can spend on each question. You also have less control than other qualitative methods. Like if you're doing a one-on-one interview, you can exert a little bit more control. But when you have a whole group there, you can run into challenges from time to time. It really does require group processing skills beyond just asking questions. And you have to be able to negotiate participants who dominate discussions. It's really important to think about the skills and qualities of the facilitators you're using. Ideally, you want to have language skills that match those of participants. You want people who function well in a group setting, people who don't have strong opinions about the topics and questions. And if they do, they're not going to put them out there. And they're not using focus groups as a platform for their views. I mean, I had one example a while back where I was paired up with somebody who really wanted to kind of correct what the people were saying during the focus group. And, you know, I gave dagger eyes and all that, but like it wasn't necessarily working. But I had to kind of talk to that person and say, you know, this is not appropriate to do. You need to be very good at active listening, as Daniel just described. And you want people who can summarize participants' ideas in a way that keeps with what's expressed. And, you know, that can be a challenge for some people. I was in a focus group where I was just getting so angry because like they were trying to nuggetize what people were saying and reflecting back, and they just were like missing the mark in what people actually shared. I would participate in a focus group if I were you, if you haven't and you're facilitating them, just to be on the other side of things, because it's actually kind of fun and it helps to actually, you know, refine your own practice. Keep in mind that there's some people, you know, who you might not want facilitating your focus group. So for example, a provider who delivers or has a vested interest in a new intervention or program that's being asked about, that person might not be the best choice. Also, because people are good at doing individual interviews, it doesn't mean that they're going to be similarly skilled in focus group facilitation. And the same lesson holds for persons skilled at working with communities. So community organizers and advocates and coalition leaders, you know, they're not always the best, you know, fit for a focus group facilitator. And that is why it's really important to do those trainings that we talked about earlier. If you are going to be engaging people from the community, you know, like I think it really is important to not just focus on what are the skills for moderation, but like what are potential areas of microaggressions? What is particular about this population? In a lot of the projects that we do, we work with communities to help them do focus groups, but because they're often mandated to do it, but they don't actually have the support infrastructure to do them. Next slide. What are the responsibilities of the facilitators? Well, their goal is to really keep the discussion on topic, ensure that the topics are culturally appropriate for the majority of the group participants. This is a big one. Help participants avoid extremely personal disclosures because they might regret that later. The focus group is not a therapy group. You want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak and listen. At the same time, you also want to recognize that silence or maybe topics that people don't want to speak about, that can also be revealing. That might have something important to signify about what it is you're studying. And then there's the recorders or scribes or assistants. We always recommend having, you know, 2 people, the moderator and the assistant. And that person should really help greet people when they're coming into the room, you know, set up equipment and food items. And you really do want to be choosy about your food items. You don't want things that are very chewy or gooey or that like crunch and make a lot of noise. That person's going to take comprehensive notes. I always invite our recorders or scribes to chime in appropriate, like if I've missed something or if I didn't follow up on a lead, like it's nice to have that person there. And they can also help resolve unexpected problems. And maybe this one's not so unexpected, but you know, when the latecomer comes, you know, it's nice to have them kind of greet that person and bring them up to speed if you are going to integrate them into the group. Next slide. What can go wrong in a focus group? Please share in your chat box. Are there anything in the chat box? 1 or 2 people dominate the discussion. Someone takes over the conversation. Yep. Conflict between participants. And when you do encounter that conflict among participants, you know, like that's where you kind of want to, you know, make it clear that we want that diversity of views. Turns into a discussion-based group. Yes, these are all things we definitely want to avoid. Yep, people who leave early just to get the money and had no real intention of full participation, that is super frustrating. And sometimes we just go with the flow, but we do try to like prep people before that focus group so we don't have that experience. But that is something that can happen. Expressing an opinion, trying to encourage more sharing. Yeah. Let me tell you about one of my experiences. So here was my worst focus group experience ever. It was situated in a waiting room in a strip mall methadone clinic that was just closed for the lunch hour. And so like we were already limited in time because we just had that lunch hour. Clients were banging on the door for the entire hour. One of my colleagues labeled this a focus mob because there were so many participants. Really, you're limited in the number of participants, usually between 6 and 10, sometimes 12. I would not go over 12. This had a lot more people, and we were all like in a big circle. There was no good place to record. There was no table. The note taker who organized the group was late. And I was like, ooh. And then the questions were about like a particular training and some supervision practices. And there were a few people who actually took that training because there was just so much turnover in that organization. So like the questions just didn't fit because people didn't have really much to share because they didn't go to the training. And then there was a supervisor and we were asking about supervision practices that wouldn't leave the room, even though they were encouraged to leave the room. This is why attention to process is key to a great group. When preparing for a focus group, it happens. Borshika, determine the focus of the discussion beforehand. That is why you have that guide. Keep in mind that the average group takes between 90 and 120 minutes. Sometimes when we're working in organizations, we're lucky to get that hour, especially if we're working with providers. But like ideally 90 to 2 hours, 90 minutes to 2 hours. And some of this time is going to be spent on organizing and the informal socializing and rapport building. Your range and scope of topics are limited. You need to allow for flexibility in your questions and responses, probing again to get new information. And if your conversation is too focused, some people might get bored and they might not be engaged. Choosing a site, make sure it's, think about comfort, convenience, accessibility, and size. Perceptions, how do people feel about the sites? So there's several places in New Mexico that are just not good. This site might have been a former boarding school where people, had to spend their youth. Or sometimes people have very negative experiences in churches, particular churches. And so you don't necessarily want to do it there. Think about the site and what it might mean to the people you want to talk with. Think about potential for interruption, like people banging on the door. The noise level, you really don't want a noisy space. And also think about transportation and childcare. Do you have to help people? Do you have to give them a gas card or, a bus pass? And, consider even making arrangements for childcare. Confidentiality can't be assured in a focus group because you got all these people in the group and they're all talking about stuff. Participants can be reminded to please keep the conversation confidential, and we'll share some ground rules with you in a minute. General informed consent procedures should be implemented. And, in some cases, you can also implement these procedures before the actual focus group. But you do want to give a refresher in terms of what the form they signed, the day of the event. Note taking is really important. The first thing I advise the note taker to do is to diagram seating arrangements. I'll show you what the diagram looks like in a second. You want to have this diagram so you can track who is saying what. And you're going to use this diagram and notes to assign numbers to each speaker. And this will help guide the transcription because you may have had instances where you get this transcription and you don't know who's saying what. And when you don't know who's saying what, it's harder to track, who were the dominators. Ideally, there's no dominators. Some people like to use bulleted flip charts. I think it's fine to use bulleted flip charts, but for me personally, I don't think the flip charts replace taking good notes or transcription. And some people use the flip charts to just like avoid doing the note taking and transcription because they want to save money. That's not an ideal scenario for me, and I avoid it. Have 2 recorders going at once just to be on the safe side. And this next slide really is like a sample diagram. You just give everybody a number, and your note taker is going to be like, 1, here's what 1 said, 2, here's what 2 said. But really keep track. When you're doing the focus group, you'll start off with some introductory remarks. You're going to explain the purpose, why folks have been invited, why their voices are important to the project. You're going to explain the roles of the facilitator and the recorder or scribe. You'll ask permission to audio or videotape, but folks should already have advance notice about this before they show up, so they can kind of like self-select themselves out of the group beforehand. Have everybody briefly introduce themselves and be prepared to negotiate local etiquette expectations. I remember my very first focus group where I was described. It was with a Native American community in New Mexico, and the introductions pretty much took up an hour of the focus group time, and then the informed consent took up another half hour, and we had very little time to actually ask the questions. And I think this was because that particular moderator hadn't done a group in that venue before and wasn't prepared. Next slide. You want to explain the ground rules, and sometimes we'll write out these ground rules, and we'll have a little packet for people that we put, in front of them before they even show up, so they can kind of have these papers. Everybody should participate. All ideas are equally valid. There are no right or wrong answers. And again, this gets into the question or statement somebody made earlier about conflict. We really want to emphasize that everybody's views should be respected and that we should respect other people's confidentiality. So I'm not necessarily going to read this whole thing, but like here is some sample ground rules that you all can use for your own purposes. But like in other groups, it's been helpful to say a couple things about how the group works. First, because we really want to hear what everybody thinks. If it seems like someone is not speaking up, we might ask them what they think. So prepare people to be called on. At the same time, we'll ask everyone to please not interrupt so we can make sure that everybody has a chance to talk. And again, no right or wrong answers. Finally, we ask that everyone please agree to keep whatever is said here private. While it's okay to talk about the focus group generally, we ask that each of you not talk to anyone about what specific people say today. So I think that's what you really want to get into your ground rules script. Consider supplementary aids. Again, focus groups are not about quantifying what people say necessarily. If you want to do this, you might have them fill out a brief questionnaire that complements your focus group guide. You want to write out the focus group process or expectations for participants. So you kind of, like a one-pager big font. What are their expectations? At the same time, you want to have that for the facilitators. Much like that procedure document that Daniel shared earlier. Again, you can share handouts that describe the process or expectations, the focus group questions. Sometimes we will share the questions at that focus group, so it just helps keep the conversation going and people on track. Troubleshooting problems. If people don't show up for your focus group, it's really important to figure out why. Why aren't they coming? If fewer than half show up, you'll handle this based on your research design. You might shift to a small group interview. So if I have less than 5 people, I think it's a stretch to say, it's a focus group. I'll call it a small group interview. I might turn it into a dyadic interview if there's only 2 people. And if there's only 1, it's an individual interview, and I have to be prepared to shift. Some people are going to show up late. It's up to, the facilitator's discretion whether they can join. Some people have a 10-minute rule of thumb, others a 15-minute rule of thumb. It really depends on the length of your focus group, your expected length. And think about logistical difficulties at the site. You kind of want to get there early in advance of the group, and have your cell phone handy in case something happens. Asking questions, the same rules as interview questions apply. Funnel structure, avoid close-ended, vague, or leading questions. Use open-ended questions with probes, especially if the issues to be explored aren't well understood. In a 90-minute group, you might have 5 to 7 STEM or core questions that might be sufficient. And think you might spend 20 minutes on this question. Think about how many minutes you want to spend on each question. The more familiar the facilitators are with the topic, the more likely they're going to be to ask good questions. But at times it's all right to be naive sounding and be ready to ask clarifying questions. What you don't want to do is serial interviewing, a round robin exercise where you're like, okay, this person who I've assigned number 1 is going to answer the question, then the person assigned number 2 until we get to person number 7. Don't do that. You really want to have that exchange where people are building on each other's ideas and sharing their opposing views. If you're having 1 or 2 participants dominate the discussion, be prepared to step in and ask somebody else for their thoughts, and let that person know, thank you for what you just shared. Sharon might have something to add to that. Again, as Daniel mentioned, you want to avoid allowing persons with power over others to join the group or observe the proceedings. Like again, in that example of worst focus group ever, like having the frontline staff supervisors present. You also don't necessarily want to leave participants with incorrect information that could harm them. One of my early focus groups was on HPV and what people thought about it. And it was really before, before the HPV vaccination was rolled out. And we were talking with health providers about their thoughts of it. And some of them shared some information that was not quite accurate. So we had to have fact sheets that we distributed afterwards. But during the group, we were interested in capturing some of that misinformation, but we didn't want to leave them thinking their misinformation was necessarily correct. When you're wrapping up, provide opportunity for participants to share their views after the group. So you want to stick around to chat, give your phone number, your email address. And that's when you also might want to touch base with the shy person and, talk with them and see if they have anything else to share, or maybe you can have a phone call afterwards. Clean up the room, and that includes like wiping down the table. And then do a debriefing between the moderator and the recorder or scribe. So Borsika and Nicole, do you want us to go into the online interviews and focus groups quickly, or should we go into the consultation session?
Let's go into the consultation session because we had a large number of individuals who signed up, and then the slide